If part 1 stayed with you and you came back for part 2, then you already know this is more than a story, it's a reckoning. Thank you for watching, for every thoughtful comment, every reaction, and everyone who said, "We need part 2. I saw you, and this chapter is for you. If you believe women like Grace Obinna should never be underestimated, erased, or made to shrink themselves to survive, then subscribe and stand with this family. Turn on your notifications, and before we go any further, drop your country and your time in the comments so we can see just how far this force has reached. And now that part 2 is finally here, don't just watch it. Sit with it, feel it, and tell me the moment that hits you hardest, because what unfolds next is not just about power or inheritance. It's about what happens when the woman they dismissed as just the cleaner steps fully into the life, love, and authority she was never meant to touch, and refuses to be invisible ever again. Part 1 had ended with a wedding no one in that room would ever forget, and for 3 quiet weeks after that, Seoul did not belong to the board, the doctors, or the enemies still counting their losses. It belonged to Grace and Min-jun. They disappeared without disguises, without aliases, without apology, to a private coastal resort on Jeju where the sea hit the rocks hard enough to sound like old anger being washed out of the body. And for the first time in months, Kim Min-jun existed somewhere no one was watching him for weakness, betrayal, or blood in the water. Grace had seen him dangerous long before she ever saw him at peace, and there was something quietly arresting about the tenderness of a man whose name still made grown executives lower their voices. They walked the black volcanic shoreline in the mornings, ate late breakfasts on a terrace facing the water, and learned each other without urgency. Not as savior and survivor, not as patient and healer, not even as king and cleaner, but simply as husband and wife, which turned out to be far more intimate than either of them had expected. By the time they returned to Seoul, Min-jun was not recovering. He was settled, clear-eyed, and fully himself again, while Grace returned not as the invisible woman who had once pushed a cleaning cart through marble hallways, but as the founder of something that had already begun to make powerful people uncomfortable. The foundation had opened in a building in central Seoul that had once been a pharmaceutical company, its lobby floor replaced with a breathtaking mosaic of Nigerian and Korean craft that had taken 6 artisans from both countries 4 months to complete, the kind of floor visitors kept pausing to photograph because it felt too alive to simply walk across. Grace's office was on the 14th floor, with long windows, clean light, and an administrative assistant named Ji-yeon, a sharp young Korean woman who had stopped being uncertain about the situation by the end of her first week and had become fiercely protective of Grace's calendar by the end of the second, which Grace found both excessive and quietly comforting. The Global Health Initiative now had a board, a budget, a waiting list of traditional knowledge holders from 12 countries, and enough public attention to make old systems nervous. It also had a problem. And for the last 2 weeks, that problem had been circling with expensive shoes, polished smiles, and legal language sharp enough to cut skin. Becoming Min-jun's wife had not made the systems around her any less suspicious. The problem had a name. CO Group. The CO Group was not a household name the way KMJ was a household name, but it was the kind of organization that preferred it that way. A pharmaceutical conglomerate 3 generations deep, controlling a significant portion of Korea's domestic medicine supply chain, with interests in patent licensing that made them quietly essential to every major hospital in the country and loudly resistant to anything that threatened the model those patents depended on. Chairman Seo Byung-chul was 65 years old, had survived 2 government investigations and 1 attempted hostile acquisition, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He had watched the Global Health Initiative's opening with the detached attention of a man monitoring a small fire to see if it would burn itself out. It had not burned itself out since its opening, attracted international press coverage, a partnership inquiry from 2 European medical universities, and, most problematically, from Chairman Seo's perspective, a formal research proposal from Seoul National University to study the efficacy of ancestral pressure point techniques alongside conventional neurological treatment. That proposal, if accepted, would generate the kind of peer-reviewed data that could legitimize what Grace was doing in a way that no amount of corporate resistance could quietly dismantle. Chairman Seo had made 1 phone call on the morning the research proposal was published. By afternoon, the Seo Group's legal team had filed a formal complaint with the Korean Medical Association, citing the Global Health Initiative's use of the golden needle technique as an unregistered medical procedure performed by an unlicensed practitioner on Korean soil. The complaint named Grace Obinna specifically. It cited 11 months of employment records, her time as a cleaner in Seoul Heights, and cross-referenced them with the initiative's founding documents, where Grace was listed as lead traditional knowledge director. It argued, with the cold precision of lawyers who had been given unlimited resources and a specific outcome to achieve, that the same hands that had performed the Golden Needle procedure on Kim Min-jun during her employment as a cleaner had done so without medical licensure, without institutional oversight, and in direct violation of 3 subsections of the Korean Medical Practitioners Act. The complaint did not ask for a fine. It asked for deportation proceedings and a criminal investigation. Min-jun was in the master bedroom at 6 in the morning, still in dark silk pajamas, seated at the edge of the bed with the television glowing softly across the room when Grace stepped out of the bathroom in her robe, drying her hands as she caught the unusual stillness in his face before her gaze followed his to the screen. "Good morning, husband," she said lightly. He turned and looked at her like the whole room had just been reduced to her face. "Husband," he repeated, one brow lifting. "So that's what you're calling me now? Not Nkem or Obim?" Grace smiled, already knowing she had him. "Obim," she corrected sweetly, stepping closer. "I was just teasing." A faint smile touched his mouth. "You play too much Jagia," he murmured, and for a second, the warmth between them softened the room completely, until Grace followed his line of sight to the television. Her smile faded. She moved to his side, one hand settling on his shoulder as her expression went still in that particular way it did when she was no longer reacting, only calculating. The report had gone back 11 months. Back before the foundation. Back before the wedding. Back to the months when she was still invisible in his house. "They didn't just come for the work," she said at last, her tone low and precise. "They came for the woman who made it possible." Min-jun looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that chilled the air. "And they started before they even realized they were already losing." Outside, the Seoul morning was arriving slowly, the sky lightening with that clear seasonal softness, while the city below their window was still quiet in the way it never stayed for long. "How serious is this?" she asked. Not with fear. With the specific directness of someone who needed accurate information in order to act, not reassurance in order to feel better. Min-jun looked at her. "The deportation component is serious," he said. "The criminal investigation component is serious. The Korean Medical Practitioners Act has genuine teeth and CO's lawyers know exactly which sections to cite." He paused. "My legal team can challenge the jurisdiction argument and the retroactive application, but a challenge is not a dismissal, and a challenge takes time, and while the challenge is active, I'm operating under investigation," Grace said. "Which means the initiative's partnership applications freeze. The Seoul National University proposal stalls. Every knowledge holder on our waiting list gets nervous about attaching their name to a program under criminal complaint." "Yes," Min-jun said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They're not trying to arrest me." "No," he said. "They're trying to discredit the model before the research can prove it works." She nodded slowly. It was the kind of nod that wasn't agreement. It was the nod of someone cataloging a problem fully before deciding what to do about it. She stood and went downstairs to the kitchen herself, despite the staff already being awake, and came back with 2 cups of tea balanced carefully in her hands. She set one in front of him, and he looked at it, then at her, because no matter how many people worked in that house, Grace had quietly made it a rule that when it came to her husband, some things would always come from her own hands. And even now, 1 month in, with a ring on her finger and a foundation carrying her name into rooms that had once ignored her, it still landed somewhere deep in him as something he would never take for granted. "I need to call my contact at the Medical Association," he said. "I need to understand who on that board CO has influence over before we respond publicly." "And I need to call Ji-yeon," Grace said, "and have her pull every document we filed at the initiative's incorporation. If there's a gap anywhere, I want us to find it before they do," Grace said. But the words sat heavier now because both of them already understood this was no longer just about paperwork. Marriage to Min-jun had changed her life overnight, but systems did not move at the speed of love, and the truth was that while their marriage was fully legal, there were still residency filings, professional documentation, institutional registrations, and enough bureaucratic seams for the wrong people to slip a knife into if they wanted to make her life difficult. The CO group knew that. They were not trying to prove she was illegal. They were trying to create enough official-looking doubt around her credentials, her residency status, and the Golden Needle practice to make Korean institutions nervous enough to freeze her out. Grace picked up her phone, but then she stopped, and Min-jun, who had been watching her from the edge of the bed with the kind of attention that missed very little, recognized that stillness immediately. It was the same stillness she wore whenever she had already seen 3 moves ahead, and was deciding whether or not to bring him into the part of the board she had not yet spoken aloud. She looked at the phone for a second, then set it back down on the bedside table. "There's something else," she said. Her voice had changed, not fearful, not hesitant, but more measured. "An email came in 2 days ago. I didn't want to bring it to you until I was sure what it was." Min-jun's gaze sharpened. "From who?" Grace took a breath. "Dr. Chukwemeka Obi." The name landed, and she saw immediately from his face that he was already cataloguing it. "He's from Enugu," she continued. "We grew up in the same village. He knew my grandmother's name before he ever knew mine. He's a licensed physician now. He works with a Nigerian medical board and has connections with a few international traditional medicine researchers." She paused, then added the part that mattered most. "He says the complaint CO group filed in Korea has already started circulating outside the country. Quietly. Not publicly yet, but enough for the wrong people to start forming opinions." Min-jun said nothing. Grace knew that silence. It meant he was listening with his whole mind. "He's coming to Seoul before the week ends," she said. "According to him, he wants to help formally document the Golden Needle method, not just as family folklore or oral healing knowledge, but in a way that can stand in legal and professional spaces. If that happens under recognized medical and heritage documentation, it could weaken a lot of what they're trying to build against me." Min-jun's expression did not soften. "And that is what he says he wants." She moved a little closer to him, and Min-jun reached for her hand without thinking, his thumb brushing once over her knuckles as she sat close to him in the quiet of the bedroom, the television still casting pale light across the room. "I don't think he's coming to Seoul just to help me," Grace said at last, her voice calm but lower now, the kind of calm that usually meant she had already followed a thought all the way to the end before speaking it aloud. Min-jun looked up at her fully. "Why?" She held his gaze. "His email told on him. He spent more time asking how much of my grandmother's work had survived, whether I still practiced from the original method, and if I had kept the ceremonial instrument in my possession than he did asking what I actually needed. That is not the language of a man arriving only to protect. That is the language of someone coming to assess what can still be claimed." The air in the room seemed to settle differently after that. "So he's not just seeing an opportunity to support your case." "No," Grace said softly. "He's seeing an opening." She sat beside him then, close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a second neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't strained. It was intimate, thoughtful, the silence of 2 people used to telling each other the truth even when it came with teeth. "When we were younger," she said, "I talked more freely around him than I should have. Not because I gave him anything sacred, and not because I handed him pieces of my grandmother's real work, but because he was one of the few people who didn't immediately laugh at where I came from or what I had seen. At that age, being taken seriously can make you careless in small ways." Min-jun listened without interrupting, his hand still around hers. "He paid attention," Grace continued. "Too much attention. He remembered details he didn't need. Asked questions that sounded academic at the time but feel different now when I look back. And after the foundation opened, after the article about me saving you started circulating quietly in medical circles, he resurfaced too fast, too precisely, like someone who had been waiting for the right reason to come back into my orbit." Min-jun's jaw moved once, not in jealousy, not in anger exactly, but in the measured calculation of a man rearranging threats into categories. "Then we assume he is useful," he said, "but not safe." Grace nodded. "Exactly." He looked at her for a moment, then leaned back slightly against the headboard, drawing her hand with him so she stayed close. "And if he is not safe," he said, "then he doesn't get to arrive here ahead of us." Grace's eyes flickered to his. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Min-jun said, his tone calm in that way that always made people around him more nervous than shouting ever could. We prepare for the version of him that is smiling while calculating. The corner of Grace's mouth moved faintly. That sounds familiar. You married a man with pattern recognition, he said dryly, and that earned the smallest breath of laughter from her before the seriousness settled back in. We move the needle today, he said. Not tomorrow. Not after he lands. Today. Grace nodded once. I was already thinking the same. Good, he replied. And we don't just hide it. We replace it. She turned her head toward him. A duplicate. A convincing one, he corrected. Something real enough to survive curiosity, panic, theft, or a planned search. If anybody comes too close to what belongs to you, I want them capable of leaving with the wrong thing and believing they've won. Grace studied his face for a second, then looked away with the faintest exhale through her nose. Not quite amusement, not quite admiration, but something softer and older than either. That is such a dangerous husband answer, she murmured. That is such a survival answer, he said, and his thumb brushed her hand again. We are not in the stage of life where we assume good intentions just because someone arrives in a tie and with credentials. Grace leaned into him a little then, not for reassurance, but because closeness had become instinctive between them in the weeks since the wedding. Obim, she said quietly. At the time, I thought he was hungry for knowledge. Looking back, I think he was also hungry for ownership. Minjun turned his face toward hers. That, he said, is usually how men like that mistake access for destiny. She looked at him then, really looked, and there was no jealousy in his face, no insecurity, no wounded pride, only alertness, intelligence, and the very clear understanding that a threat did not need romance to become dangerous. Did he ever make you uncomfortable? He asked, and the question landed exactly as it should have. Not possessive, not suspicious, just clean and direct. Grace answered just as plainly. Not in a way I couldn't handle, but enough that I learned to become less available with time. Minjun gave one slow nod. Then we treat him accordingly. She was quiet for a beat, then said, he may still help us with the legal side. If he wants access to the technique, then helping preserve my credibility here also protects his own route toward it. I know, Minjun said. That's why we'll let him be useful. His gaze held hers, dark and steady. But usefulness is not intimacy. And it is definitely not trust. That made her eyes soften. You really have thought this through already. Jagia, he said, almost under his breath. The moment you said his name, I was already 3 steps ahead of him. She smiled then, small but real, and he let himself look at her for 1 second longer than necessary before reaching for his phone on the bedside table. And the residency issue gets buried today, he said. Not because you need my name to stand in this country, and not because marriage is some magic permission slip, but because I refuse to let people who are losing on substance start reaching for paperwork as a weapon. Grace moved her head slightly. I was going to handle it. I know you were, he said. And now you won't have to handle it alone. He was already scrolling. Marriage certificate, updated residence filing, foundation-linked sponsorships, your institutional registration, every immigration and licensing loophole they might try to crawl through. I want all of it reviewed, corrected, stamped, and sealed before 72 hours. Grace watched him as he made the first call, then the second, then the third, and there it was again. That very particular feeling she got when she saw him move not as the man the world feared, but as the man who had decided that her peace now fell under his jurisdiction. It wasn't control. It was alignment. Protection with intelligence behind it. Within minutes, legal teams were waking up, documents were being pulled, ministries were being contacted, and favors old enough to matter were beginning to move quietly through the machinery of Seoul. But even with that, Grace's instincts did not settle. He's still coming, she said once Minjun lowered the phone. Yes, he replied. He is. And I don't think he's coming only because of me. Minjun looked at her with a stillness that had become dangerous in its own right. No, he said. He's coming because he thinks there's something here he can still take. Grace nodded once. And he'll be polite while trying. Minjun's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Then we'll be polite first. Outside, the morning light had fully spread across the glass and steel of the city, and somewhere across Seoul, Ji-yeon was already at the foundation, fielding calls and protecting Grace's day with the sharp territorial efficiency she had perfected in record time. Somewhere else, CO Group's lawyers were likely congratulating themselves for being clever enough to target documentation instead of character, believing bureaucracy would succeed where intimidation had failed. And in Enugu, Dr. Chukwemeka Obi was preparing for Seoul with the composed efficiency of a man who had spent most of his adult life learning how to make ambition look like service. At 31, he had become exactly the kind of man people in his city pointed to with approval. Polished, educated, articulate, a rising physician with a respected private practice, conference invitations, hospital partnerships, and the kind of upward-moving reputation that made older men clap him on the back and call him the future. He lived well too. Not obscenely, not loudly, but well enough to be noticed. A high-rise apartment in one of Enugu's better neighborhoods. A white SUV with tinted windows. Tailored shirts. Good watches. A kitchen he barely cooked in. The clean, disciplined life of a man who had built himself carefully and wanted that careful construction admired. But beneath all of that polish lived a frustration he had never been able to bury. The knowledge that years ago, he had once stood dangerously close to something extraordinary and had still ended up outside it. Back when Grace was younger and more open with the parts of herself she would later learn to protect. He had listened to her speak about her grandmother's work with an intensity that, at the time, had passed for respect. He had asked questions. Too many of them, though she had only understood that in hindsight. About pressure points. About body memory. About why some techniques could not be written down exactly the way modern medicine required. He had looked at Grace then not just as a woman he admired, though there had been that too, but as a living bridge to something rare, something old, powerful, and medically disruptive enough to make a man like him impossible to ignore if he could only get his hands on it properly. And for a long time, he had told himself that what he wanted was noble. Until the patient. 5 months earlier, a high-profile private case had landed in his orbit through a discreet referral. A wealthy businessman whose condition had worsened beyond what conventional treatment was fixing. A man whose family had become desperate enough to entertain things they would never have admitted publicly. Chukwemeka had thought of Grace's grandmother's method almost immediately. Not because he understood it, but because he had spent years storing away fragments of it in the back of his mind like a thief collecting map pieces to a place he had never been invited. He had not told anyone the full truth. He had not presented it as what it was. Incomplete, half understood, and dangerously beyond his training. He had simply convinced himself that his medical education, his instincts, and what little he remembered would be enough to bridge the rest. It wasn't. He tried a version of what he believed the method required. The body reacted badly. The pressure point was wrong, or the timing was wrong. Or perhaps the deeper truth was simpler and crueler. Sacred knowledge in fragments is still ignorance. The patient did not recover. The official explanation stayed clean. Complications. Advanced deterioration. Unresponsive progression. But privately, something in Chukwemeka had curdled after that. Not guilt in the way it should have been. Not humility. Something uglier. He had come away from that failure not with reverence for what he did not know, but with the sharpened obsession of a man who had convinced himself the method itself had not failed, only his lack of full access to it. Since then, the golden needle had stopped being an old curiosity from Grace's grandmother's world and become, in his mind, a withheld key. The answer he should have had. The thing that might have changed everything if only it had been placed in more capable hands, his hands. That was why Grace had gone still when his email arrived. Because beneath the polished concern, the professional wording, the offer of help with Nigerian board documentation and international legitimacy, she had heard the old hunger still breathing underneath it. He had not asked like a man coming first to protect her. He had asked like a man checking whether the object of his obsession still existed, whether the line to it was still alive, whether the woman who carried it had become vulnerable enough to need him. In his apartment that morning, with the city just beginning to wake beyond the glass, Chukwemeka packed for Seoul with precise, almost ceremonial neatness. His passport was set beside his credentials. His medical board papers were clipped and arranged. His presentation folders were packed carefully. His tailored coat lay folded over the chair. And beneath all of that respectable preparation sat the truth he would never say aloud. He was not boarding that flight simply to help Grace Obinna defend herself. He was going because this was the closest he had come in years to getting near the full technique again. Near the source. Near the thing he had once tried and failed to possess through fragments. He opened the side compartment of his leather carry-on and looked down at a folded sheet of paper that shouldn't be with him but the real owner. Old handwritten notes, pieced together from memory after conversations Grace had once believed were harmless, bits of body mapping, symbolic phrasing, and partial observations that had never been enough to do anything except tempt him into arrogance. He touched the paper once, then let his fingers rest there a second too long. Not because it held real power. It didn't. But because it reminded him that for years now, he had been living with the private humiliation of knowing he had once reached toward something extraordinary and still come away empty-handed. He zipped the bag slowly, his expression calm, his face giving away nothing. By the time he picked up his passport and headed for the door, Dr. Chukwuemeka Obi had already decided exactly who he would be the moment he landed in Seoul. Helpful, measured, credible, professionally indispensable on the surface. And underneath all of that, a man arriving with polished shoes, a doctor's smile, and the quiet determination not to leave Korea without getting closer to the needle than he had ever been before. By the time Dr. Chukwuemeka Obi's flight touched down in Seoul, he had already arranged his face into the version of himself he intended the city to meet. Composed, useful, mildly tired from travel, and carrying just enough professional concern to make his presence feel generous rather than strategic. The airport air hit him cool and clean as he stepped out into the arrivals corridor, his carry-on rolling behind him, his charcoal coat folded neatly over one arm, his phone vibrating almost the moment he switched it back on. There was a message from Grace first, simple and warm enough to feel familiar without giving too much away. Welcome to Seoul. I've had a car arranged for you. You'll be staying at the Hanul Grand in Yonggu. Rest first. We'll meet this evening. He read it twice, and something in his mouth nearly softened into satisfaction. Not because the message itself meant much, but because hospitality was always useful. Hospitality created rhythm. Rhythm created access. Outside, a black sedan was already waiting with his name on a discreet tablet, and 40 minutes later he was being driven through a city of glass, muted autumn light, and controlled wealth that made even his better neighborhoods back home feel less finished by comparison. Seoul looked expensive in a way that was not trying to impress him, which he found irritating in a way he would not have admitted aloud. The Hanul Grand was exactly the sort of place a man like Kim Min-jun would put someone he needed close but not too close. Luxury without noise, polished marble, quiet staff, fresh orchids in the lobby, private elevators, a view over the city that suggested power without having to spell it out. Grace had chosen well. Or perhaps Min-jun had. At check-in, everything was already handled. Presidential-level courtesy. No delays. No paperwork. No inconvenience. His suite was on the 23rd floor, all clean lines, soft lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the quiet polished luxury of a place designed for people who never had to ask the price. He stood in the center of the room for a moment after the bellman left, taking in the kind of comfort that did not need decoration to prove itself, then loosened his collar and crossed toward the window with his phone in hand. He had just begun to consider whether to shower before seeing Grace when the screen lit with a number he did not know. He answered on the third ring. "Dr. Obi," said the voice on the other end, smooth, aged, and controlled in the particular way of a man accustomed to speaking only when he expected to be listened to. "I trust your journey was comfortable." Chukwuemeka was still for half a beat before replying. "Who is this?" A low breath, almost amused. A man with an appreciation for useful people. Chairman Seo Byung-chul. Silence sat between them for a second, not empty but deliberate. Chukwuemeka had heard the name long before he arrived in Korea. Men like Chairman Seo Byung-chul did not belong to ordinary conversation. They existed in the margins of power, spoken about more often than spoken to. So when the man identified himself, something in Chukwuemeka's face tightened before he could smooth it away. "Chairman Seo," he said, quieter now, the surprise slipping through despite himself. "This is unexpected." Unexpected does not mean unwelcome, Dr. Chukwemeka Obi, Chairman CEO replied. Men like you do not board international flights for women they once admired unless there is something else in the luggage. The insult was polished enough to pass for observation, but it still landed. Chukwemeka did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, though not quite as steady as he intended. I'm not sure what you think this is. Not what, CEO said softly. What remains? Silence. Chukwemeka's grip changed on the phone, subtle but tighter now. On the other end, Chairman CEO's voice lowered, smooth and devastatingly calm. Let us not waste each other's time, Doctor. You are not the first ambitious man to confuse access with entitlement. And I am not the first man to notice when a physician builds his name too close to a treatment he was never fully prepared to perform. Chukwemeka swallowed once before he could stop himself. You should be careful with accusations like that, he said, but there was a thinness in his voice now, something strained beneath the control. Chairman CEO did not raise his tone. He did not need to. No, he said. You should. A beat passed. Then another. A private patient. Months ago. An unconventional intervention attempted outside approved procedure after conventional medicine stopped producing the outcome the family expected. A final report written in language neat enough to close questions before they were fully asked. A surviving assistant who remembers more than she was compensated to forget. Shall I continue? This time the silence on Chukwemeka's end was different. Not strategic. Not composed. Just too long. He stood up without realizing he had done it. His pulse moving once, hard, in his throat as he crossed toward the window. The city lights below looked suddenly far away. How? He started, then stopped, hating the weakness in the word the second it left his mouth. He cleared his throat, but the damage was done. Chairman CEO had heard it. What do you want? Chukwemeka asked at last, and though he kept his voice low, the fear beneath it had begun to show in the careful way he was choosing every word. Chairman CEO did not hesitate. Grace Obinna's credibility dismantled. Her legal footing weakened. Her work separated from her name. Her method documented, stripped, and repackaged where it can be controlled. And above all, his voice cooled further, the needle itself. Chukwemeka stared at his own reflection in the darkened glass, and for the first time since landing in Seoul, he looked less like a polished physician and more like a man who had just realized he had walked into a room with no exit. You know about the needle, he said, and this time there was no disguising it. Only caution, and the first unmistakable edge of fear. Doctor, CEO said softly, I know enough, and this time there was no amusement left in him at all. I know more than you. I know what it did to a man everyone had already counted dead. And I know enough to understand that if the method can be reproduced, it will not remain in the hands of a foreign woman who thinks marriage has made her untouchable in my country. The words landed, and with them came the thing Grace had sensed correctly from the beginning. This was not only about paperwork, not only about cultural suspicion, not even only about greed. It was about power offended by the idea that something this valuable had entered Korea through the wrong woman. Chukwemeka let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had regained some of its control, though not all of it. And what exactly, he asked carefully, do you believe this arrangement does for me? Chairman CEO did not rush his answer. It keeps certain professional complications from becoming public, he said. It places you in rooms your current title alone would not open. It gives your name relevance in a field that is about to become internationally contested. And, he paused just long enough for the point to settle, it places you near the one thing you have been trying unsuccessfully to understand for years. Chukwemeka's jaw moved once. Very slightly. But enough. The chairman had called because he had identified the pressure points correctly. You are asking me to stand beside you while you separate a woman from work that came through her bloodline, Chukwemeka said at last, his tone low and deliberate. I am asking you, CEO replied, smooth as ever, to help ensure that something with this level of medical and commercial consequence does not remain in the hands of one emotionally attached individual with no institutional control around it. Chukwemeka gave a soft exhale through his nose. Not amusement, not quite. That sounds cleaner when you say it than it is. Most useful things do, Chairman Seo replied. You are a doctor. You understand how often the official version and the practical version are not the same thing. That landed because it was true in more ways than Chukwuemeka liked. He turned from the window and sat down slowly on the edge of the chair nearest the glass, still holding the phone a little too tightly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter now, more careful, the confidence from earlier thinned by the realization that this was no ordinary conversation. If you are involving me in this, he said, choosing each word with visible caution, then I need to understand exactly where I stand. Chairman Seo's reply came smooth and immediate. You stand where many ambitious men stand when they are offered a second chance to be useful. Chukwuemeka swallowed once, then forced himself to continue. I am not in a position to make mistakes right now. No, Seo said. You are not. The words were not raised, but they landed with enough weight to make the room feel smaller again. So listen carefully, Doctor. You do not need to do anything dramatic. You do not need to rush. You only need to remain close enough to be useful. Let her talk. Let her remember who you used to be. Let her lower the part of herself she keeps guarded. Watch. Learn. And when the time comes, you will know what matters and what does not. Chukwuemeka said nothing for a moment. Not because he had nothing to say, but because too much of this had begun to make sense in ways he did not like. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. I assume, he said carefully, that if I am expected to be useful, then I will also be expected to remain discreet. Chairman Seo did not answer immediately. When he did, his tone was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Discretion, he said, is usually the difference between a manageable situation and a regrettable one. Chukwuemeka's jaw tightened slightly as the meaning settled exactly where it was meant to. Understood, he said at last, and this time there was no pretense in it, only the controlled voice of a man who had recognized the shape of the threat and knew better than to test it too early. Good, Chairman Seo replied. Then rest, Doctor. You've had a long flight. We will speak again. The line ended there. Chukwuemeka remained seated for several seconds after the call, the phone still in his hand, the suite around him suddenly too polished, too quiet, too expensive to feel comfortable in. Below, Seoul glittered as if nothing in it had teeth. He stared at the black screen for a long moment before setting the phone down carefully on the table beside him. What unsettled him most was not that Chairman Seo had contacted him. It was how easily the man had reached past professionalism, past caution, and put his hand directly on the softest part of the situation. By the time Chukwuemeka finally stood, one thing had become painfully clear. Whatever he had told himself this trip might be when he boarded the plane, it was no longer that. He had not arrived in Seoul as a free man. He had arrived as a useful one. He showered, changed into a tailored white kaftan set with understated embroidery and a clean, structured fit, then added hand-beaded local Odegwa beads, a sleek wristwatch, and polished black palm sandals that gave him the effortless elegance of a man who knew his presence entered a room before his voice did, before meeting Grace that evening in the hotel's private tea lounge on the mezzanine level, where the lighting was low, the music discreet, and the seating arranged to create the illusion of privacy without ever quite promising it. She was already there when he arrived, seated near the window in a flowing Ankara gown, the bold patterns softened by a delicate necklace on her neck, elegant in a way that made her impossible to read at a glance. When she looked up and saw him, her smile came quickly, warm and bright, her eyes moving once over the tailored white kaftan, the hand-beaded Odegwa beads on his wrist, and the quiet confidence with which he carried it. Ah, Chucks, she said softly as she rose to her feet, a note of easy admiration slipping into her voice. Seoul has not humbled your wardrobe at all. He laughed under his breath, the sound low and genuinely pleased, his own gaze settling on her with open appreciation. And you, he said, taking in her beautiful look, the grace with which she seemed to belong everywhere she stood, look like somebody's soul should be paying rent to. That drew a real smile from her, the kind that softened her face without making her easier to read, and for one brief moment, something familiar passed quietly between them. Not innocence exactly, but the comforting shape of an older version of themselves that still knew how to greet each other without armor. Grace, he said. His voice was more human than it had been since he landed. Chucks, she replied, and there was just enough old familiarity in her tone to make him believe she had not completely sealed that door. They embraced briefly like old friends who had once shared more history than they had ever named properly, and when they sat, she asked about his flight, his mother, his practice, Enugu traffic, the airport food, all with a natural ease that made the first 15 minutes feel almost disarmingly ordinary. He told her the trip had been smooth. She laughed lightly and said Seoul would spoil him if he let it. He asked how marriage was treating her, and she smiled in a way that looked private and faintly tired at once. Marriage is, she paused, then stirred her tea slowly. Useful. He looked at her. Useful. She shrugged one shoulder, eyes dropping briefly to the cup. This city is not kind to women like me unless they are attached to something bigger than themselves. Minjun was practical. She let the words settle before continuing. He was recovering. I was surviving. We needed each other at the right time. It became what it became. Chukwamika studied her face, and because he still wanted to believe himself the better reader of people, he missed the precision with which she was feeding him exactly what he would be most tempted to believe. Grace sighed softly and looked out toward the window. I'm not saying he is a bad man. He has been generous, protective, more than I expected, honestly. But love. She gave the faintest humorless smile. People romanticize survival too much. Sometimes a woman just chooses the arrangement that lets her breathe. It was subtle work, the kind that only functioned because she kept it small. No melodrama. No overplaying. Just enough bitterness to feel lived in. Just enough self-interest to sound plausible. And Chukwamika, who had always thought of himself as perceptive, felt something in him loosen exactly where she wanted it to. And now? He asked. Grace met his eyes. Now I want stability, influence, protection, space to build what I came here to build. If that means staying close to a powerful husband, then I would be foolish not to understand the value of that. She said it calmly, without shame, and he nodded slowly as if what she had admitted merely confirmed what he had suspected all along, that somewhere beneath the polished founder, the respected wife, the careful public image, Grace was still a village girl who had learned to survive by attaching herself to the strongest available structure. That was the version of her he could work with. The version he could outmaneuver. You sound tired, he said. I am, Grace replied, and this part at least was not entirely performance. Every institution here wants to use what I know while pretending not to trust where it came from. She lifted her cup. And now there are complaints, documentation issues, licensing threats. You understand why I asked you to come. I do, he said, and then carefully, but if I'm going to help you properly, I need to know what is still intact. What still exists. Not just the theory, Grace. The material history. The continuity. She gave him a look halfway between reluctance and consideration. You mean the needle? He didn't answer immediately, which was enough answer. Grace let the silence stretch, then leaned back slightly. You haven't changed much, she said with a small smile. Still pretending your curiosity is only professional. And you, he said, are still pretending you don't know when something this rare needs to be protected by the right hands. She lowered her eyes as if thinking. Maybe, she said quietly, I'm just tired of carrying it alone. The sentence landed exactly where it needed to. While Grace and Chukwamika were still downstairs in the private tea lounge, speaking softly over tea and old memories, Minjun's men entered the suite above under the cover of a temporary 2-minute camera loop so clean and elegantly timed that no one watching the internal feed would have noticed unless they had already known exactly where to look. They did not move like burglars. They moved like men who understood that the most effective intrusion is the one that leaves no emotional footprint behind. One photographed every document before touching it. Another opened the polished carry-on with gloved hands and checked each compartment with calm efficiency until he found the folded notes tucked where Minjun had expected them to be. Not a full notebook, not anything complete, but enough to confirm that Chukwamika had come to Seoul carrying more than professional concern. The papers were removed, scanned, and taken back by the men of the rightful owner, then replaced with a visually identical stack of conference materials folded to the same thickness, weight, and shape so precisely that even a suspicious man would have needed a reason to suspect. A third operative mirrored the contents of a secondary device left charging near the desk, copied his recent contact activity, then returned everything exactly as it had been found. No drawer was left half open. No zipper sat at the wrong angle. Even the glass of water beside the bed remained in the same position, untouched except by sight. By the time Grace was smiling across a teacup and letting Chukwuemeka believe he was making careful progress, the only thing that had actually changed in his suite was that what he thought he still possessed had already been quietly reclaimed. And when he eventually returned to the room later that night, loosened by confidence and warmed by the dangerous satisfaction of thinking the evening had gone well, nothing in the suite felt disturbed. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing suggested that anyone had entered at all. He moved through the room with the unconscious ease of a man who believed his secrets were still where he had left them, unaware that the one thing he had carried across continents hoping to keep close was no longer truly his, if it had ever been. Across the city, in the master bedroom of the penthouse, Min-Jun stood near the windows in comfortable house trousers and a fitted t-shirt, reading through the files his men had already transmitted with the quiet focus of a man who preferred his control neat. Grace had long since changed out of the Ankara gown she wore to the hotel and into soft shorts, a tank top, and plush slippers, and now sat at the edge of the bed with relaxed ease, one hand resting beside her as his legal chief updated them on speaker. The residency issue had been neutralized more cleanly than either CO Group or Chukwuemeka would have believed possible. Marriage-linked documentation, spousal residency protections, foundation sponsorship classifications, and a ministerial intervention through a cultural preservation framework had closed every gap that had once looked exploitable. More than that, the legal team had already fast-tracked a new protective filing through a cultural and medical heritage channel that would begin formal recognition of Grace's grandmother's method not as improvised, foreign treatment, but as protected traditional knowledge under supervised review, with legal barriers around unauthorized replication and misuse. It wasn't full victory yet, but it was enough to change the board. Enough to make their enemies late. Grace listened without interrupting, then looked at Min-Jun once the call ended. So they can't force me out on paperwork anymore. Not without starting a public fight they are not prepared to survive, he said. Grace's face lit with that quick, pleased satisfaction she never bothered hiding from him, and she smiled, leaning back slightly on the bed. Ah, Obim, she said, shaking her head once with soft amusement. Sometimes you are too good at this. You should have seen the look on his face, acting like he was still the one in control. Min-Jun's mouth moved at that. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count. And you let him keep it. Of course I did, she said, adjusting a pillow from the bedside. Why would I rob him so early? Let him enjoy his little confidence. Men like him do dangerous things when they think they are clever. She adjusted the pillow again, her eyes gleaming now with the private energy of a woman who had no intention of being caught unprepared. Tomorrow, she said, I'll make it easier for him. Min-Jun turned his head slightly toward her, interested now in the way he always was when she was about to do something beautifully unreasonable. How? I'll tell him where the needle is. That got his full attention, though there was no alarm in his face, only curiosity, and the quiet respect of a man who had long accepted that his wife was at her most dangerous when she sounded calm. Where will you say it is? Grace smiled, the kind of smile that usually meant somebody else was about to have a very bad week. Somewhere believable, she said. Somewhere close enough to tempt him, but ordinary enough that he'll think he's the only one clever enough to notice it. Min-Jun held her gaze for a second, then a quiet breath left him, almost a laugh. That is deeply disrespectful. Exactly, Grace said, clearly pleased with herself. Because men like him are easiest to lead when they think they're discovering something a woman failed to protect properly. Min-Jun shook his head once and finally smiled properly, the expression low, warm, and far too familiar now. Marrying you was a very strategic decision. Grace lifted a brow at him. You did not marry me for strategy. No, he said, his voice lowering just enough to alter the space between them. But I am enjoying the return on investment. That pulled a real laugh out of her, soft and unguarded, and for a moment the room belonged entirely to them. Not to Chairman Seo, not to Chukwuemeka, not to anyone still standing outside the life they had built and imagining it was theirs to enter. What neither Chairman Seo nor Dr. Chukwemeka Obi knew was that the real golden needle had already been moved before now. Not to a vault, not to a bank, not to anywhere that announced itself as important, but into a plain lacquered cosmetics case tucked among Grace's personal things no outsider would have thought worth searching twice, protected not by spectacle, but by the far more reliable security of routine, misdirection, and the simple fact that people looking for power almost never expect to find it hidden among the ordinary. The next day, just past noon, Chukwemeka arrived at the foundation and was taken upstairs to Grace's office while the building moved around them in its normal rhythm. Assistants crossing corridors, phones ringing softly behind glass, footsteps passing now and then beyond the door, the energy of active work making the privacy of her office feel all the more intentional. Grace was behind her desk when he entered, dressed simply but beautifully, her expression brightening in a way that made him feel, briefly and dangerously, as though the years between Enugu and Seoul had folded themselves neatly away. "How was your night?" she asked as she rose to greet him. "I hope the hotel treated you properly." He smiled, the sound easy now, and said something about finally sleeping properly for the first time in days, which made her smile as she motioned him to sit. Their first few minutes unfolded gently, almost disarmingly so. Small talk about the food, people back home, and the strange little realities of being visibly black in Seoul, including the way a stranger had boldly come up to him the night before to ask for a picture as if he was some kind of celebrity, and for a little while it almost felt like what it was pretending to be. Two people from the same soil, now dressed in success, remembering the familiar shape of where they came from. Grace asked after his practice and let him talk. And he did, with the polished confidence of a man used to being respected in rooms that had once ignored him. He asked after the foundation, and she answered with a quiet pride she did not bother shrinking, telling him how difficult it had been to build something that insisted traditional knowledge deserved structure, legal recognition, and international dignity without allowing it to be swallowed whole by institutions that only respected what they could brand and bill. "That has always been the problem," she said at one point, rising from her chair and walking slowly toward the shelving wall near the windows. "People dismiss things they don't understand until they see the power behind them." She seemed thoughtful, the way someone does when they've carried the weight of something meaningful alone for far too long. Her fingers rested lightly against one of the shelves before she turned back to him and continued, almost as if speaking to herself more than to him. "My grandmother always trusted that some knowledge holds its own power, as long as it's respected," she said softly. She looked out the window at the city, then back at him. "I think I understand now, in the way she meant it." There was no performance in her voice. No weighty lesson, just quiet honesty, the kind that draws people closer without them realizing it. Chukwemeka said nothing, letting the thoughts settle between them. Grace crossed to the built-in storage shelf near the far side of the room, entered a code with casual familiarity, and opened a concealed inner compartment lined in dark felt. Inside, nestled securely within a compact glass display safe built for protection rather than beauty, lay the golden needle. Or what Chukwemeka believed, with immediate and rising hunger, was the golden needle. Even from where he sat, the sight of it changed something in his breathing. Grace looked at it for a second before speaking, and when she did, her voice carried none of the dramatics of mysticism, only the quiet reverence of someone discussing inherited precision. "This is what frightened them," she said softly. "Not because of its potent, not because it belongs in tales, but because my grandmother understood the body in ways most trained people still cannot name, and trusted that knowledge to guide her hands," she said simply. She let her gaze linger on the shelf, not on him. Pattern, timing, restraint. He found himself close enough to almost touch the glass case, his pulse tightening. She closed it halfway, just enough to let him sense the object, then turned the code lock into place with casual precision. "Until the paperwork is complete," she said lightly, "I prefer to keep certain things where I can account for them myself." Grace stepped back, smiling. "Come. Sit. If you're going to help me survive paperwork here, the least I can do is let you complain properly about travel and bureaucracy first." He sat, but his attention remained with the case, with the angle of the cabinet, and the quiet authority in her voice. And for a long moment he thought the city had made her harder but not wiser. Thought she was still willing to trade sacred things for survival if the pressure was applied correctly enough. Neither spoke. Only the city below, the faint hum of the office, and the understanding that the real power in the room had nothing to do with anything else. That night, in Chukwuemeka's suite, he held the phone longer than he should have, staring out at the city that glittered below like a map of everything he both feared and desired. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful, but threaded with the unease he could not hide. "I have confirmed the location." On the other end, Sio's silence stretched, sharp enough to make him swallow. "You are certain?" the older man asked, low and deliberate. "Yes," Chukwuemeka admitted, every word carrying the weight of the truth he could not twist. She thought she was controlling the room, but exhaustion had softened her edges, made her rely on protection over principle. "And the needle?" Sio's voice was soft, almost velvet, but beneath it was the steel that made men like Chukwuemeka tremble inwardly. "If your men move carefully," he said, "by tomorrow night we will have it." Hanging up, the quiet pressed in. Not trust, never trust, only the razor-sharp alignment of ambition and fear. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace and Min June sat together at a small, candlelit table in the private dining room of their home, glasses of wine in hand, the subtle clink of crystal punctuating their shared laughter. "To surviving the day," Grace said, raising her glass. "And to knowing we were always a step ahead," Min June added, his eyes warm, steady, and completely present with her. They drank slowly, savoring both the taste and the rare calm that came from knowing the real needle rested safely out of reach, hidden exactly where it should be, and that the grandmother's notes, the one thing Chukwuemeka believed gave him leverage, had already been reclaimed and secured in the rightful hands. The victory was quiet, unannounced, but absolute. Somewhere else, Chukwuemeka sat in his suite, imagining the prize before him, unaware that the page he had clutched for years had quietly slipped from his grasp. Every plan, every calculation now rested on a shadow of what he believed he could claim. The weight of Chairman Sio's expectations pressed against him, mingling ambition with fear, and reminding him that the needle in his hand, or what he thought was never truly his to control. Far away, Sio waited with that same cold certainty that power could be seized, yet never fully held. The night hung heavy over the city, sharper than the lights below. When men reach for power, what happens if the prize they seize is only a shadow of what they truly wanted? Chukwuemeka wrestled with ambition and fear, convinced the needle or what he believed to be it was finally within reach. Chairman Sio weighed control against the costs he could not yet see. Grace and Min June moved quietly, every glance and word a shield, every secret a weapon, every victory carefully hidden. Who really holds power when the world thinks the game is over, and the true prize has never left your hands? Thank you for following part 2. I'm reading all your thoughts in the comments, and if you missed part 1, make sure to check it out to catch the full story. Where are you watching from, and which side would you choose when nothing is as it seems?